In 1828, when Charles Sturt travelled down the Darling River, he found the water in places was too salty to drink. Later, when he reached the mouth of the Murray River, he was forced to turn back because it was closed. In 1923, Victoria's Water Commissioner, Sir Ronald East, was photographed at Nyah, near Swan Hill, standing astride the Murray River, which was just a tiny trickle. Dry rivers are not sick. They simply reflect the state of the biosphere at that point. Rivers are how water, evaporated mostly from the oceans and rained over land, flow back into the ocean again. Any water drawn from a river for irrigation isn't lost. It ends up evaporating and returning as rainfall, either somewhere else on land and flowing out to sea through another river, or raining directly into the ocean. What is natural for the Murray-Darling rivers is what is happening now, a dry, followed by drought-breaking rains that make the rivers flow again. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an insight into the murderous implications of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's October 2010 Guide to the Proposed Basin Plan, and to provide a real scientific and human solution to the challenges currently facing the Murray-Darling Basin and more generally the nation. Don't be a fool. The present mad drive to shut down the Murray-Darling Basin is not an accidental effect of a merely misguided policy. Rather, it is a witting and deliberate attack on our sovereignty and the very heart of our nation, and other nations as well. The basin not only feeds much of Australia, but its products sustain millions of human beings elsewhere in the world. The recently released Murray-Darling Basin Authority report is the bastard child of two 1994 Australian government official reports, which, on the surface at least, together laid the groundwork for the current drive to shut down Australia's food bowl in order to depopulate the nation. In reality, these were simply the marching orders of a long-standing policy issued top-down from the British Crown and City of London, that the world's population must be slashed from its present almost 7 billion human beings down to 2 billion or even less, and that Australia's population must be slashed to its so-called carrying capacity of 6 to 7 million. Since Prince Philip founded the ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, in 1963, which he chaired from 1971 to 1976, as a branch of his World Wildlife Fund, the ACF has led the crusade within Australia for shutting down our agro-industrial capacity, depopulating Australia and reducing us to feudalism. The ACF earlier this year filed a formal complaint with the then Federal Environment Minister and also a two-time ACF President, Peter Garrett, complaining that human population growth is a, quote, key threatening process to biodiversity, end quote. The same ACF today shares an overlapping leadership with the notorious Sustainable Population Australia, which openly calls for reducing Australia's population. The strategic reality is this: the British Crown, City of London-centred global financial system is disintegrating by the minute, and that British imperial nexus, typified by the Inter-Alpha group of banks, intends to wipe out any and all sovereign nation states, and therefore their populations. which might pose any resistance to these imperial schemes. The World Wildlife Fund is at the heart of these British plots. It was founded in 1961 by 3 individuals. Prince Philip, who has repetitively stated that he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to, quote, contribute something to solve overpopulation, end quote. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, a former member of the Nazi SS, and Julian Huxley, the longtime president of the British Eugenics Society, who lamented that because the Nazis had discredited the British-originated policy of eugenics, imperial rule by a master race, these imperial goals would now have to be pursued under other language. The so-called Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, the gaggle of self-styled scientific experts behind the shutdown of the basin, whose members include Tim Flannery and Mike Young, is a front for this very same World Wildlife Fund. The Murray-Darling Basin accounts for 65% of all Australia's irrigated crops and produces well over 1/3 of Australia's food. The present cutbacks will slash that capacity far beyond official stated figures. Anyone proposing to slash that capability can only have one goal in mind: genocide, as per Prince Philip and his World Wildlife Fund. That was the intent behind the draconian proposals to deal with non-existent so-called global warming, which the Crown's flunkies were unable to ram through here, and is the hidden motive behind this sudden savage push to rip up the Murray-Darling Basin. With the intention to depopulate the planet, free market economics and environmentalism have been pushed virulently globally, particularly since the final takedown of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. In Australia, the Crown tasked its 3 stooges, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard, to manage the radical shift to free market and environmental policies, such as the Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan, that have systematically dismantled Australia's physical economic infrastructure and destroyed the nation's ability to support population growth. Hawke and Keating are prominent members of the Fabian Society, all of whose founders and chief advocates, such as Sydney and Beatrice Webb, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, were raving advocates of eugenics, who openly proposed the mass murder of millions upon millions of human beings. For example, H.G. Wells, in his 1902 book Anticipations, wrote,
"It has become apparent that whole masses of human population are, as a whole, inferior in their claim upon the future to other masses. And how will the new republic treat the inferior races? How will it deal with the black? How will it deal with the yellow man? How will it tackle that alleged termite in the civilized woodwork, the Jew? And for the rest, those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people who do not come into the new needs of efficiency? Well, the world is a world, not a charitable institution, and I take it they will have to go. The whole tenor and meaning of the world, as I see it, is that they have to go. So far as they fail to develop sane, vigorous and distinctive personalities for the great world of the future, it is their portion to die out and disappear."
His buddy, George Bernard Shaw, proposed the use of the lethal chamber, wherein, quote, "a great many people would have to be put out of existence simply because it wastes other people's time to look after them." Hawke and Keating's successor, John Howard, who continued their policies, is the son of a member of the 1930s pro-fascist paramilitary movement, the New Guard, which was organised and financed by City of London bankers to, if necessary, run a coup against the federal Labor government so as to crush any moves towards economic sovereignty. As the Citizens Electoral Council documented in an explosive report published in the September-October 2007 New Citizen newspaper entitled Howard ALP Privatising Murray-Darling Water, contrary to the suicidal illusions of many farmers whose political loyalties lie with the coalition, all three, Hawke, Keating and emphatically Howard, with Rudd and Gillard now included, are responsible for the destruction of the National Food Bowl. If farmers had acted upon that CEC expose at that time, the government and Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan would have been defeated by now. This is how the ALP Liberal National plot worked. Beginning in 1994, the Council of Australian Governments agreed to a water reform framework under the auspices of Paul Keating's national competition policy. This changed the status of water from that of a human right to a tradable commodity, so speculators such as Macquarie Bank, the author and beneficiary of most national competition policy reforms, could make money by driving up its price at the expense of food production. This scam could only succeed if water was scarce, so the Howard government seized on the drought to impose it. Also in 1994, following the push for global depopulation at the United Nations Cairo Conference, the House of Representatives Committee for Long-Term Strategies conducted an inquiry into Australia's population carrying capacity. The resulting report, entitled Australia's Population Carrying Capacity, One Nation, Two Ecologies, recommended a government policy shift toward a range of politically and socially realistic population goals that included a preferred option to stabilise population at 23 million, but also included an option to reduce population to as low as 5 million. With an Orwellian flourish, Recommendation 11 stated,
Australia should adopt a consumption strategy to be developed around the challenge of learning to move from high levels of consumption based on high levels of material throughput per unit of consumption to lower levels of consumption based on lower levels of material throughput per unit of consumption. Such a strategy need not reduce quality of life, although it may change the way in which people enjoy quality lives.
Along with a recommendation that a Ministry of Population be created at a cabinet level, achieved this year with the appointment of Tony Burke as Population Minister, now the Sustainable Population Minister, just in time for the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's report. The committee's overall recommendation was that in regards to population increase, quote, Australia should adopt a precautionary policy in accordance with the principles of ecologically sustainable development, end quote. This is the exact language of the 2007 Water Act that set the terms of reference for the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. These two reports initiated the policy shifts that led directly to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Under John Howard, water rights were separated from land title. The Murray-Darling Basin Commission started interstate water trading in 1998. Howard initiated his National Water Initiative in 2003 and the National Water Commission in 2004. Immediately before his sudden resignation in 2007, Victorian Premier Steve Bracks charged that Howard's actual intent was to privatise all of the Murray-Darling Basin's water. Then, on August 2, 2007, New South Wales Minister for Lands and Regional Development, Tony Kelly, declared, quote, I am just a little bit worried that this is all about making water another commodity so that Macquarie Bank can be able to buy and sell it and make an absolute fortune. Howard's final action was his 2007 legislation, the Water Act, which established the authority, later to absorb the separate Murray-Darling Basin Commission, and charged it with determining, quote, the volume of water required to maintain and restore environmental assets using best available science and the principles of ecologically sustainable development," end quote, as stated in the foreword to the report. The Water Act captured the spirit of the 1994 population report, targeting the level of population by imposing utterly fraudulent environmental objectives on Australia's food bowl. Under fire from angry communities within the Murray-Darling Basin, at the October public consultation meetings, Murray-Darling Basin Authority Chairman Mike Taylor washed his hands of his report's crushing impact on the food industry by insisting that the authority's task was solely defined by the Act's environmental objectives and not by any concern with human beings. Farmers, irrigators, communities, the basin as a whole have to recognise the truth of this, which means that they were set up, yet again, by the John Howard Liberal National Coalition. This brings us to what must be done now. To immediately begin rectifying the effects of the assault on our sovereignty through anti-human, no dams, no development, environmentalist ideology run top-down by the Crown's World Wildlife Fund and its local arms here like the Australian Conservation Foundation, we can start with the proposals of our world-famous water and infrastructure expert, Professor Lance Endersby, to divert some of the floodwaters from the tributary rivers of the Clarence River system inland, and to also build the Melbourne to Darwin high-speed railway. To understand the necessity of this approach, you need to move away from looking at the Murray-Darling Basin as an isolated entity entirely cut off from Australia and a single issue, and instead approach it from a much larger perspective. The intention to depopulate is not confined to the Murray-Darling Basin, it is targeted at the whole of Australia. The basin is our national food bowl. It grows the food consumed by millions of people in Australia and also worldwide. The free trade psychosis that assumes we will simply import our requirements ignores the fact that there is a global food shortage due to similar free trade and/or green insanity that has been imposed on most other countries. However, the Murray-Darling Basin is also the best example of Australia's amazing potential if allowed to develop. An area with just 6% of the nation's water runoff utilises 80% of it to produce over 1/3 of the nation's food. Imagine Australia's potential if the much higher rainfall areas of far north Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia were developed along the lines of the Bradfield Scheme, the Reid Scheme and the Fitzroy River Scheme. You get a sense of what we have achieved in the basin when it is looked at historically through the eyes of explorer John Oxley, who in the summer of 1817 wrote in his journal while travelling along the Lachlan River,
"It is impossible to imagine a more desolate region. The farther we proceed northwesterly, the more convinced I am that, for all practical purposes of civilized man, the interior of this country westward of a certain meridian is uninhabitable, deprived as it is of wood, water and grass."
12 years later, in 1829, it was Charles Sturt's turn to describe the landscape near where Darlington Point is today, along the Murrumbidgee River.
"The plains to the north and northwest bounded the horizon. Not a tree of any kind was visible upon them. It was equally open to the south, and it appeared as if the river was decoying us into a desert, there to leave us in difficulty and in distress. It is impossible for me to describe the kind of country we were now traversing, or the dreariness of the view it presented. Neither beast nor bird inhabited these lonely and inhospitable regions, over which the silence of the grave seemed to reign."
These two explorers were looking at what is Australia's most developed agricultural region, the Murray-Darling Basin. It has been the constant improvements in the management and technology applied to this region over the last 90 years or more, specifically in water conservation, that has transformed this once barren area into a much more developed biosphere, which is now able to sustain much larger quantities of life. Leaders who bared witness to the droughts in the 1860s and 1890s, who saw the devastation and totally dry rivers that they caused, were determined to conserve waters at times of excess for use in sustaining the inland during periods of drought. The truth is that rather than man's intervention into the Murray-Darling Basin being the cause of the problems, it remains a validated fact that the reasons there are near-permanent bodies of water flowing in the basin are a result of man's management over the biosphere. In that same spirit, the Murray-Darling Basin could be even further developed through integrated infrastructure projects that would revolutionize the system, namely Professor Endersby's proposed two projects, the Clarence River Scheme and the Melbourne to Darwin Fast Freight Railway. The Clarence River Scheme is simple yet very effective. It has been designed to hold up a conservative percentage of the flood waters in the heads of the Boyd, Man, Timbora and Upper Clarence rivers with dams, thus providing a regulatory capacity for the rivers downstream, as well as the ability to then send some of the water over the Great Dividing Range. This could be done using pump lifts and head ponds, using off-peak base load power, and then producing hydroelectricity on the way down into the Mole River. It would hold up the water a final time on the Dumaray River, with a regulatory dam to send consistent flows down the Dumaray, McIntyre, Barwon, and finally the Darling rivers. This scheme, as envisaged by Professor Endersby, would add over 1,000 gigalitres per year to the Murray-Darling Basin. This is roughly the same amount of water contributed by the Snowy Mountain Scheme. Not only is water management a necessary investment for the Murray-Darling Basin, the 24-hour Melbourne to Darwin fast freight train will break the basin's dependence upon tyranny of distance crops and enable diversification into higher value horticultural crops, which will in turn improve the efficiency of water use. As proposed by Professor Endersby, the main trunk line of the double-track high-speed route would start out in Melbourne, move north through Shepparton, going up through Griffith, then on to Dubbo, where it joins with a line from Sydney and Newcastle. From there, it follows on to Narrabri, then Moree, with a branch off to Brisbane. Then the main trunk route continues north to Roma, which also has a branch off to Brisbane, but also to the ports at Gladstone. Jumping back on the main trunk route, we continue on to Mount Isa, then on to Katherine, and finally to Darwin. With a Glass-Steagall approach to reorganising the economy, which would separate normal banking functions, which benefit the community, from the bankers' wild, speculative activity, just as US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the 1930s, in order to launch America's recovery from the Great Depression, these examples of visionary development can be easily financed through a national bank, which will provide a real transformation of the entire Australian economy. Furthermore, these projects will beautifully intersect and complement the Global Reconstruction Initiative launched by the American statesman and physical economist Lyndon LaRouche around the development of the North American Water and Power Alliance, NWAPA. This includes many of the flow-on projects, including the Bering Strait Tunnel, the Eurasian Land Bridge, and similar developments in Asia, Africa, Central and South America. Through such a global development perspective, humanity will be able to engineer the biosphere of the planet
to increase the biosphere's power to support life. It will also reverse decades of physical economic looting of the productive capacities of nations by the British Crown, City of London globalisers.
To make this a reality, though, it requires you to stand up and fight against the assault on our nation's sovereignty, against the push globally to depopulate and kill off people. Compromising on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's plan is not a win for the basin or the nation. It needs to be burnt and buried, where it can decompose back into the environment where it may be better used. Join the CEC and our fight against the deliberate policies of genocide typified by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's plan, non-existent global warming, and the fraud of so-called sustainable population. If you don't, you will soon find that it's your head on the chopping block.